Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar called Protecting Academic Integrity in the Age of AI. We're here today to talk about how academia can be safe, ethical, and ahead. Let's just wait another second here to let people in. It's really nice to see so many familiar names in the audience today. Okay, looks like most are in. So a couple of housekeeping items here before I dive in. We'll have dedicated time for all of your questions. So on Zoom below where it says Q&A, feel free to add your questions as soon as they come up. Just know that we'll have that dedicated time in the end, but sometimes it's just easier to write down your question as it comes up so you don't forget about it. The chat is enabled as well, so if you have any more technical issues, feel free to add in the chat and I'll be monitoring it. Other than that, this webinar is being recorded and I'll be sending out the recording a few hours after the webinar is over. So if you want to share it with your colleagues, rewatch any specific part, just know that we've got you covered there. Okay, let's dive into the agenda here. So in just a moment, I'll be introducing our speaker that you already see on the call today. From there, we'll dive into challenges facing modern research that we know of in academia. Of course, always invitation. Feel free to use that chat function and share any additional challenges with us that we might not be aware of that you're facing. From there, we'll talk about what is generative AI, kind of like an introduction to Gen AI, as well as Site Assistant. And really, I think the heart of this webinar is using AI in the classroom. So we'll talk about how to use Site Assistant in the classroom. We'll talk about cheating, attempts to detect or even ban AI tools, and questions such as why do professors even assign term papers or any writing task? And then lastly, as I mentioned, we'll have that live Q&A enabled for you. Okay, let me present our speaker here. So we have Dr. Sean Rife on the call today. Sean is the head of academic relations at SITE, as well as a co-founder of SITE and an associate professor of psychology at Murray State University. Sean has been actively incorporating AI and large language models into his own classroom, experiencing firsthand both the challenges as well as opportunities that these tools present to faculty and students. Welcome to the webinar, Sean.
Thanks. Happy to be here. Julie.
My name is Julia Heason. I'm the Director of Growth Marketing at Research Solutions. And as you can probably already tell, I'm your moderator for today. Okay, without further ado, Sean, the floor is yours.
All right. So, yeah, thanks, Julia. Appreciate it and appreciate everyone making time. I think we're going to hopefully cover a decent amount of ground and hopefully maybe answer some questions and maybe raise some new ones as well. So, so I'll start out just by, talking about some challenges that, we're sort of seeing in academia. And I'll get in a second some assumptions that I'm going to make as I give this talk. But, I think, for most people who are sort of in the academy, who are, doing teaching, who are doing research, who are doing, as I am, a combination of the two, you can relate to a lot of this. So, there are new AI tools that are raising questions about, research integrity and even some questions about what research integrity actually is. I'll go through sort of my approach to that and then what I think about that and how I teach, what I teach my students. But definitely, the use of text generative AI, this is a thing that has really sort of uprooted a lot of our assumptions and the way that we do our work. And so yeah, so we'll talk about that directly. But then there's also issues that have been with us, since probably goes back to the Lyceum, to ancient Greece. There's, for example, information overload. Okay, that one doesn't go back to ancient Greece, but it's definitely an issue today. There is, this varies from specialty to specialty. My own area, where I spend time studying things like technology and also moral and political psychology, and there's just more stuff, than I can keep up with. When I was doing my dissertation, there were 3 whole papers that had the word Facebook in them. It's larger now. So, it's just an issue of not being able to keep up with everything that is being written about your area of specialization. And so, I'll talk a little bit about how you can use some of those new AI tools, which are, causing some of these concerns that can actually be your friend in a lot of ways. And then we also have, issues about fragmented access, limited access to certain papers or no, single source for papers. And then, just sort of this perennial question about, quality of the, research that is being done, as well as a lack of reproducibility. So, reproducibility, replications. I'm a social psychologist, so if you're familiar with the term replication crisis, that is a thing that has really, motivated me throughout my career. And we'll talk in various points about how some of these technologies intersect with some of those questions. Um, Let me go ahead and just get out of the way some assumptions, and then I'll talk briefly about the AI tool that I use, and just so we're all on the same page, and so that I'm making all of my biases clear from the very beginning. So some assumptions. Text generative AI is here to stay. Text generative, what I'm talking about here is things like ChatGPT. So you can ask the system a question and it will provide an answer in natural language. This is, the sort of thing that everyone started paying attention to a few years ago with the, GPT 3.5, which made a lot of waves. That technology is simply what I call too good not to use. Um, it is it is something that, I always say your students are going to use it. And, I know that, there are studies that have been done about sort of how, what percentage of students report using these kinds of tools. And I see, numbers that range from 25% all the way up to 50, 60%, somewhat depends on how you ask the question. But my assumption is that there's a lot of response bias built into that. And, probably people are saying no a lot more when they should be saying yes, and probably never say yes when they should be saying no. So, my assumption is just that my students are using this technology. And I ask students, every semester that I teach, I go around the room, I say, how many of you have used, ChatGPT on a writing, assignment or some other homework assignment in one of your classes? And, keep it between us. And, it started out a few years ago. You saw like a few scattered hands raised. Now it's reliably 30%. And again, a lot of the no's are probably people who just don't want to disclose that. Um, so, I just have decided as a professor, as someone who teaches as part of his job, I'm just going to assume that everyone's using it. Okay. Um, Also, I'm going to assume that, this technology is increasingly present in the workforce. It is something that, not only are my undergraduates and graduate students using, but, graduate students at other institutions are using as well. And so, the point that I like to make is that, students graduate from our undergraduate program or our graduate program, they're going to either go on for additional education or they're going to enter the workforce. And in both of those instances, they are probably competing with other people who are using these tools. Okay. Because if my students are using it, I'm going to assume that everyone else's students are using it. Um, and that shouldn't be a surprise because it is a useful technology. Um, and just spending a little bit of time playing around with it, you can see the use cases pretty clearly. But wrapping all this up, and I don't think this is a hard sell. We all actually do care about our students. We want them to do well. We want them, we want to do a good job teaching them the material and preparing them for their future, regardless of what that might entail. And so we want to put our students in a good position, after they're done with us and are moving on. And so with that in mind, I think of it as part of my job now to teach students how to use this technology. And I'll get into that, some of the ways that I do that in just a bit. Now, the tool that I use should come as no surprise because I co-founded the company is Site Assistant. So Site Assistant is Site.ai's text generative AI chat utility that's built for research. So our platform has a number of different products. Site Assistant is I think the one that people are most familiar with these days. Um, But we were founded back in 2018 doing AI for citation analysis, and now have brought a lot of that experience into this tool, Site Assistant. And what really makes Site Assistant useful, and why I'm using it in this context, is that it's really designed for research. So it leverages only scholarly research. It doesn't go out and do web queries. It doesn't give you WebMD as a source. It rests solely on established scholarship. So the data that are sort of behind Site.ai's assistant product are really what differentiates that from a lot of other players in the space. Um, so you can use it to provide a sort of a search utility. You can use it to find new articles. Um, and it's highly customizable. You can tell it what journals to search from. You can tell it, what specific papers to look for answers in. You can give it year ranges. You can tell it what sort of citation style you want it to use. And it's also very transparent. It will compose an answer to a given question, and then it will also show you the text that it found in a given source that it's using to back up that question. So it really is a tool that is designed specifically for research. And it's the tool that I teach my students to use. They all get free access because I am their professor. That's my number one. If you walk away from this remembering only one thing, the first thing I would say is that teach your students how to use these tools and teach them how to use a tool that's designed for the thing that they're doing. If you've used ChatGPT to ask it sort of empirical questions, especially if you've used it to ask questions that are maybe things that a fair good deal amount about, it gravitates towards answers and sources that are for a lay audience. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's what the tool is designed to do. But it's probably not what you want if for your own research or for what you want to teach your students to use. I'll real quick just go over a few things, just talking briefly about what Site Assistant is good at. So summarizing research on a topic. I teach both graduate and undergraduate courses, and the example I mentioned this technology and how to use it basically in every class that I teach, but where I really go sort of full on and spend basically 2 to 3 class sessions on this specifically. Is in my department has a research methods course where students have to collect their own data, write a paper summarizing that data, sort of the whole research experience. It's our upper level research methods course. And the when students sit down and they're sitting at we teach it in a computer lab. A lot of them start with the same question, which is, I don't know what I want to research. I don't know what I want to do. Right? I don't know. Because these are often juniors in college, and they've had plenty of classes, and so one of the things that I like to say is, look, you know go back to your notes from one of the classes that you found super interesting and find a topic that you found in that super interesting class that you think might be a good topic for your paper. And then I tell them, go into Assistant and ask it about what some recent developments are in that area. So that's summarizing research in a given area. That's sort of first thing that I tell students to do. It's really great at giving a high level summary. But you can also tell this technology, hey, we want to identify trends, maybe emerging areas of research. My favorite version of this is, telling my students, hey, you want to do your paper on, I'll give an example from social psychology, cognitive dissonance. That's where you're holding two ideas in your head simultaneously that are not compatible. Ask it, what are some unanswered questions in the area of research on cognitive dissonance? It'll do a pretty decent job of, identifying sort of unanswered questions, emerging trends, new areas, new lines of research. It can also, pretty straightforwardly answer empirical questions using scholarly literature, and give you the scholarly citations as it goes. You can also use this technology to identify controversial topics. So, if you're, again, I tell students, if you're not getting a lot of mileage just about the unanswered questions bit, you want to go a little bit harder, ask it about, what some controversial ideas are on that topic. And then, brainstorming research ideas. Um, that kind of, I guess, encompasses everything that we've already talked about. But the idea is that what you've got in this one tool is sort of a combination of research discovery and evaluation, all kind of in one place. And it's a way of use. You can use it very intuitively just by talking to it. Um, so the first, sort of use case for this kind of technology, from my perspective, is, just, in the classroom is just telling students, hey, you can use this to help you figure out what you want to do your semester-long project on. Um, uh, I actually had, in one way that really this technology is different than a traditional literature search. This is my favorite example now. I had last semester, I had a student in that Methods 2 course who had this really interesting design for a study. It had to do with basically spatial perceptions and political ideology. So basically, in America, conservatives think Texas is larger and liberals think California is larger, like physically larger, right? Um, and I was like, that's a great idea. I think that's super fun. I have no idea how to search for papers on, this topic, right? Um, and so I just went into Site Assistant. I said, you know, you want to do a study? And I just described the study that he was planning on doing. And I just said, what are some papers that might be useful to read in relation to this methodology? Came back with like 10 references, all of which were directly related to what he was trying to do, and none of which, just being frank here, none of which I would have been able to find, not without like a week of like digging through literature and maybe emailing people and like trying to figure out, okay, it's called like among the terms that are related to this is cognitive cartography, which is not a thing I ever would have thought of. But Assistant is able to figure it out just by me asking the question. So anyway, okay, so I've already sort of said I use this in the classroom and I teach my students to use it in the classroom. Let's talk about the elephant in the room, and that is cheating. So can this technology be used to cheat? Of course it can. Um, let's not kid ourselves. But let's also not kid ourselves and sort of pretend that this is a new problem. Um, and then the thing that I like to point out, and this is where I usually get a bit of pushback, and maybe it's because of the way that I frame it, but we all, any professor, if you're giving any kind of out of class writing assignment, you're already kind of accepting that there are going to be some forms of cheating that are going to take place because students have been getting their roommate, their boyfriend, girlfriend, parents sometimes, best friend to write their papers for them. Or they've been paying people to write their papers for them. This has been going on. Again, talk about things that go back to the ancient Greece and the Lyceum. This is probably one of them, right? Um, yeah, this has already taken place. Now, this technology will make cheating more common. Um, it definitely has that capability, and this is an important caveat. Only if professors continue to teach and assess in the ways that they have always taught and assessed. So really, I think about this technology not as sort of, when we first were introduced to GPT 3.5, and everyone was kind of responding to it in the moment. The really instructive example that I give is I was at the bar on a Friday talking with some colleagues about, oh yeah, new technology is going to really change the way that we work. And, for one colleague, one friend of mine that I was talking to, for her, it was Armageddon. It was the end of the world. This is like, why even bother teaching anymore? Then a few minutes later, another friend of mine arrived, joined us, and we were like, yeah, we're talking about this Chat GPT thing. And he was like, oh, that thing's great. I've been using it to write exam questions. It's that bimodal response that you get, where for some people it's the end of the world, and for other people it's just a great new tool. I think we can appreciate both components. One way that people have responded to the existence of this technology is to say, well, let's just find it and ban it. right? This is the way that we deal, I've traditionally dealt with things like plagiarism. Turnitin, my university has a Turnitin subscription. I have used it for years. Turnitin is a great product. I very much like Turnitin. It's great at finding plagiarism. I have I have failed some students because they, after multiple Turnitin reports telling them they need to reword things, have failed to do so. So I believe in that technology when it's appropriate to the task at hand. The problem is detecting AI generated writing at best is a kind of cat and mouse game or whack-a-mole or whatever your preferred analogy is. The ability to detect AI generated writing will advance, and then the AI generated writing technology will itself advance, and then we have to play catch up. That's one problem. The bigger problem, from my perspective, is the problem of false positives. Um, the last I checked, and I'll pick on Turnitin again. The last I checked, their false positive rate for their AI generated writing detection software was, I think, around 1 to 5%. Um, you think, oh, that's not huge. No, but for the one student who gets flunked on a paper because they got falsely flagged as using AI, that's huge. And so, from my perspective, I would much rather have, I don't know how many papers, use AI undetected if they're not allowed to, if students are not allowed to use it. I much prefer that to happen than, a single student get falsely accused of academic misconduct. And in fact, if you actually read through, the sort of, the instructions and the material on any of those detection tools, the vast majority of them, and I know Turnitin's product does this, they say our product should not be used as the sole source of information as to whether or not a student used AI in an assignment. Um, so I am not a fan of this approach for that reason, but also, again, as I alluded to earlier, this is becoming the norm. I'd rather teach my students how to use it effectively and ethically myself rather than simply tell them no, because they're not going to be told no later on in the workforce, in graduate school, or at least in my mind, they shouldn't be. There are some interesting developments that you may have heard of surrounding a technique called watermarking, and that's basically where the AI tool will insert and remember a certain set of key words or phrases that it can then use later on to determine that, yes, in fact, this was something that was AI generated. That's a very interesting idea. It requires a lot of buy-in. I'm not convinced that that is the way forward. But in terms of detecting the use of this technology, it's probably the best, route that we have at our disposal. Okay. Excuse me. So with that in mind, let me go ahead and move on and say, all right. So we're not detecting and banning. We're not, sort of outlawing everything from the outset. We're accepting that students are going to use this. We're going to teach them how to do it. Where does that leave us? Well, I want to start addressing that by actually asking, putting a question to all of you, and that is, why do we assign papers? Why do we assign any out-of-class writing assignment? Um, and I'm happy if people have other sort of use cases that are interesting. I'd be happy to hear them. But for me as a professor, there are two major things that I have, traditionally prior to the existence of AI, things that I have used. The term paper, for example. Two things that I want it to do. One is just assess the extent to which the student knows and understands what they're talking about, right? They've integrated information from multiple sources. They've read the papers that they're talking about. They understand the concepts. They can think critically about those concepts. And I can assess that, with a term paper. Fair enough. The other thing is simply their ability to write. So, my field is a writing intensive field in a lot of ways. And so, if you're going on to graduate school or if you're, going to get a job in the field, you got to be able to write and communicate effectively. Well, the second one of those, given the existence of this technology, I'm not so sure that that is a thing that we need to emphasize to the extent that we have traditionally emphasized it. How important is it that students can write well from scratch. Depending on the field, I don't know that it's necessarily the most important thing, because the technology has really taken care of that problem for us. Um, the other component, testing knowledge, testing ability to think critically, all of that, that is a thing that I have, over a number of years of variously revising my assignments, revising everything that I do, given the existence of this technology. That is a thing that I now reserve for the good old-fashioned in-class exam. And it's interesting, I was kind of moving away from emphasizing in-class exams when this technology became more prominent, and I've gone, a 180. I've come full circle on it, and really, I have more exams in my classes now than I did before, simply because I'm reserving that in-class exam time for, assessing students' knowledge and their ability to think critically about a given topic. Um, so, there are probably other reasons to assign papers that I'm not familiar with or that are maybe specific to your discipline. But, from my perspective, asking that question is really key because that shows me what I care about and what I need to do, either, incorporating the technology or simply do elsewhere, say an exam. What I do in terms of, my own teaching, I explicitly tell students it's in my syllabus. You may use AI products, AI tools in assignments unless you are told otherwise. I make that explicit. Other professors do not. Some professors hate me for doing that. But that's my policy. And I have the one caveat, I think I alluded to this earlier. The one caveat that I have is that if you use an AI tool in an assignment, you have to tell me what tool you used, and you have to tell me how you used it. So how did the thing that you used, did you use it as a first draft? Did you use it to, check your terminology? Did you use it to format your references? You have to tell me the things that you use the tool for. Um, and, so that sort of combination of I'm going to let you use it, and I'm also going to request that you tell me when you do. And it's interesting. Um, this last semester, I had maybe 4 or 5 students on a single, on the, sort of the final assignment for one of my classes, actually say that they used it. So, the other part of this, from my perspective, is actually crafting assignments in a way that, they're not really amenable to, to using AI for. So I've gotten into the habit of, making any kind of out of class assignment that they're going to have to turn in any kind of written product for, making that something that is some combination of inherently interesting to the students, so they'll want to do it, which, by the way, is a thing that we should try to do anyway. And two, something that's difficult to really plug into an AI and get an easy answer from. So my favorite example of this actually is the one assignment that I had last year where I said no AI for. I teach a senior seminar class on basically current events in psychology, and one of the assignments at the very end of the semester is you have to have an uncomfortable conversation about a controversial issue with someone that you're close to. And the nice thing about that is that most people can have opinions about things. And it's an easy lift to simply summarize what the conversation was about and what was said. And it's probably actually harder to tell an AI tool. Imagine that you're a senior in a undergraduate psychology class and your professor has asked you to do this assignment and here are all the terms. It's probably easier to just do it. And so that's how I've really refined a lot of the writing assignments that I do have. To make them ways that are not really amenable for AI, or can properly incorporate that technology. I also have a number of really direct ways that I've integrated Site Assistant into the classroom. So, the first is an assignment that I call documenting your journey. So this is back in that same research methods class. I'll, spend time in class and, have students do lit searches, have students, ask assistant questions. But then the assignment associated with that is you have to take notes on what you asked assistant, what it said in response, and then how you thought about that response in relation to your project. So there's a little bit sort of a diary associated with this that you then have to turn into me. And so it lets me see how students are sort of thinking about the responses that it's getting, what questions they asked after seeing that list of responses, and then how that affected their overall attitude toward the project. Um, I also have really done a lot to integrate reading and writing days in class. The classes, the only class at this point that I have a term paper for is that methods class. And at this point, it is basically a flipped classroom. It's not officially, but it basically is. We spend the majority of our time in that classroom with students on their computers, actually doing writing, actually doing lit searches, doing assistant queries, finding papers. And I walk around the room and I help people and say, oh, maybe try asking it this question, try rephrasing your question this way, ask about that one paper. Um, I find that's an immensely more valuable, way to spend my time as a professor, um, sort of walking them through how to use this new technology in an effective and ethical way. If nothing else, in the context of a class with a major writing assignment, this really does help students to start writing. I always tell my students the first step to writing is to just write something. And actually, what I've done, I don't really have this up here, but one thing that I have done more recently is I've told students, hey, look, if you've got writer's block, ask Site Assistant a question and then copy and paste that into your paper. There's your starting place. The evil big white page, empty page before you is now gone. Your job is to take what you started with and modify it and make it into something that is actually directly addressing what you're doing in your study. Um, so again, this is not, the way I've done it is not necessarily a flipped classroom, but if you're running low on time, that's a perfect opportunity to say, take whatever lectures you have, move those online into video, and spend more time doing hands-on stuff actually in the classroom. You can also really demonstrate, I think, pretty clearly to students that this can be a really useful aid in reading. The typical practice, if you're reading a paper, even a paper that's in your area, I don't know, maybe I'm dumb. I'm always encountering, oh, there's a new term. I've not heard that one used before. Oh, there's a theory that I'm actually not familiar with. What do? Well, you pull out your phone, you go to your computer, you Google it, right? The problem with that, and this is less of a problem maybe for some of the people on this call, but maybe more of a problem for students, is that Google tends to point students towards non-scholarly sources, and in the same way that ChatGPT also does. So by using a tool like Assistant, you can actually have students use the tool as an aid when they're reading. If they come across a new phrase or a new term or a new theory that they don't understand, they can ask Site Assistant and it will give them an answer that's grounded in the actual scholarship on that question rather than some summary page that is maybe useful for a layperson who is not writing, a term paper on the subject. And so that just directly sort of solves that problem. The idea is that, oh, sorry, I jumped the gun. I talked about allowing students to use AI tools and modifications to out-of-class assignments. Sorry about that. The idea here is that overall, what we're doing is we're showing students how to use text-generative AI tools, in the most effective and ethical way. And so I often say, look, could you, use a bunch of assistant queries to basically string together, some text about a given topic and then use that as your term paper? Sure, sure. And I say explicitly that if that is what you're doing, then you got to tell me that that's what you did. Is that going to be an A paper? Probably not. Because the things that I tend to grade on, and it's visible in the rubric, is things like critical engagement, things that are a bit more human that Assistant maybe isn't necessarily the best at doing. So, I always say if you want to use, the AI to basically get out of the assignment, that is your decision. You probably will not get a super great grade on it, probably pass. Or you can do what I'm asking you to do, and you can actually learn to use the technology effectively, and you can get a good grade. You can get a B or an A. And the idea is sort of a carrot and a stick from my perspective. You're saying, hey, you can do the bad thing, but I'm telling you how to do the good thing. And that will probably help you later on in life. Okay. I'll just wrap up here before we get to Q&A, and got a few other things that I believe Julia wanted to talk about. But I'll go ahead and just end my bit with some remaining questions. So, one thing that I think we need to grapple with is this question of, look, is the age of the term paper actually just over? Does this cease to be as useful an exercise as we have traditionally thought? And from my perspective, the answer to this question is probably, yeah, the sort of age of the term paper being a sort of capstone product, that you end a certain kind of class with. We might want to consider just doing away with that. And so, some of the things that I've been thinking about, and one that I'm actually going to implement in the fall, is actually, rather than having students write a paper, maybe have them give a presentation. And maybe have them give a presentation where they send me the list of papers that they read that are related to the topic, and letting me ask them questions about what they read about in person as part of their presentation. So this is sort of getting in more into the area of like an oral defense. And I think that actually this is a really, sort of interesting and perhaps even more useful exercise than simply asking students to write a term paper. Now, depending on your field, depending on your area, what you're trying to teach, your mileage will certainly vary. And there are other ways of sort of maybe modifying the term paper requirement. Maybe one other thing I've played around with is just revising homework assignments or removing the term paper and instead having a series of self-referential assignments that are maybe what we might think of as sort of reflection writing, but on topics that students actually care about, and not, actually, again, making it more of a heavy lift to actually plug that into an AI than it would be to just answer the question, right? The idea here is that we also have, in addition to teaching students how to use the technology, we have an opportunity to make assignments more engaging, more personally relevant. And so I think that, we probably, we want to take that opportunity if we can, and use it to become better at what we do, rather than sort of trying to prevent it from happening in the first place. So um, I will end there. Julia, do you want to talk briefly before we get into Q&A about bringing sight to your school?
Absolutely, yes. Thank you so much, Sean. And I do see a few questions already, so just get to that in a moment here. I'm going to get a link in the chat here as I speak. So if you want to learn more about Site Assistant, and how to bring it to your school, feel free to head over there, fill out the form, and then we'd be happy to jump on a call with you, or if you have any questions, yeah, clarify those, whatever those are. And then the next thing I wanted to mention real quick, let me just grab the right link here, is we have an AI prompt handbook. Yeah, that was the right slide there.
There we go. Sorry.
All good. It's a free ebook, super helpful with prompts, how to use Site Assistant specifically. So feel free to download that with the link that's now in the chat. And let us know, of course, if you have any questions that come up while reading this. Okay, now let's jump to the questions. The first I see is, has there been discussions in academia and journal publishing at large about using LLMs to recognize and catch articles published via content mills and submitted to publishers?
Yes. And in fact, I can only speak for my field, but for the major journals in my area, they all have AI policies stated somewhere in their submission process. In terms of detecting it, excuse me, there is discussion about this. I think the sort of elephant in that room is basically, the old problem of false positives. And I just, I don't see that as getting a lot of uptick. The problem of content mills, actually, this predates AI. And so, content mills, publication mills, whatever you want to call them. I think, ideally these would be papers that are getting rejected on their merits, meaning that they don't have many merits. But I think that you're going to have to, in my opinion, the major solution to that problem is more humans in the loop. And the problem with that is that in addition to the technology being available, you also have more papers being generated, which means more humans in the loop is more expensive or simply not possible. So I guess this is a long-winded way of saying I don't have an answer to that question at the moment yet. Um, One thing that's interesting is the way that the scholarly publishing landscape over the past 10, 15, 20 years has kind of flattened, just in the sense that there are a lot of, frankly, lower quality outlets that will accept papers, maybe with a page fee. And so, this gets into a broader question about, it's almost a sort of sociology of science question of how do we think about scholarly output, and maybe simple number of journal public of articles being published, maybe that's not the best way to think about that going forward. So again, long-winded way of me saying I don't have an answer for you. People have talked about it. I'm not super impressed, but I also don't necessarily have a great alternative. So um, I'm happy to hear alternatives if someone wants to pop in with one.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for answering, Sean, and great and definitely interesting question. The next question is regarding Site Assistant. What is the subject content by academic discipline of Site Assistant? Is it skewed to scientific research, humanities, general, etc.?
Yeah, this is great. And in fact, Julia, if you have it handy, the link to data and services on the very bottom of Site's page, if you don't mind just copying and pasting that somewhere where people can look at it. Um, so uh, so our site system is based on DOIs. So we have anything with a DOI. Um, with that in mind, the content that we have does basically follow in a pretty straightforward way the size of the scholarly field. So if you look at the link that Julia is sharing, you'll see, biology, medicine, they're at the top, right? That's just where the most is going on. And then, it trickles down a little bit. You get into, things like physics, math, chemistry, all those. Then you get to my beloved social sciences. And then where you really see sort of our content drop off is getting into more into the humanities, certainly art as a field. That is probably, I think that is our like least populated subfield, or rather topic area. Um, so there is a correlation with basically the size of the field or the amount of scholarship. Um, I don't necessarily view that as being a problem. The only areas where coverage I think becomes an issue related to discipline is sort of scattered, and it has to do with the norms of the field. So the example that I always give is, historians love to write books. A good friend of mine is a historian. He has like it's floor to ceiling books in every space that he has access to. Historians love their books. Some books have DOIs, and so they're in our system. A lot of books don't. So there's sort of weird, sort of, I guess, one-off, norms of the discipline areas where our coverage might be less than what I think it should be. Um, but yeah, that's the simple summary is that it tracks really well with just the size of the field.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I did add the link here. If there's any follow-up question, feel free to reach out.
Thank you.
Actually, there is a follow-up question. Where is the research content from? Does it provide access to articles, books, papers?
Yes, great question. So, Site gets all of its underlying data from two, big categories, two basic ways. One is we crawl the web looking for open access papers, author posted versions of papers that are, identical to the version of record. We crawl the web all the time, 24/7. We suck in all those PDFs. We extract the data from them. So anything open access, anything in those lines we have. What really actually does make Site different in terms of other players in this space is the fact that we also have access to paywall articles. We have access to closed access scholarship. And we get that from the publishers themselves. So we have indexing agreements with publishers who will send us the entirety of their back catalog, as well as an ongoing deposit of new papers. And so in that way, we're actually able to expand our offering to closed access or paywalled papers as well. Um, To the second part of your question, do we provide access to the full text? We do not. Our licensing agreement does not allow us to give, our users access to the full text of the paper. If what you're looking at is, with the way that site represents an open access paper, it should show you an open access link wherever that is. But if it's a a paywalled article, if your institution has a subscription to Cite, you should see basically a link to where they can get that paper through the institution. So there's one additional step there, but it should be as friction-free as possible.
Great. Okay, one more question I see regarding Cite specifically, and then we have a few others. What is the ethical use of Cite AI specifically?
Wow, that's a great question. It's a big question with lots of different answers. So, I'll give a very general answer, and then I'll talk a little bit about, I'll get a little more specific. The general answer is just be transparent. Um, it doesn't matter what I'm doing. If I'm reviewing graduate applications to our graduate program at our university, if I'm grading a student's paper, if I'm reading a letter of recommendation, it doesn't matter if you tell me I used this tool and this is how I used it to aid in the drafting of whatever. I'm not even mad. I can't get mad at that. You told me what you did. Now, do I maybe judge that output? Do I maybe, for example, judge that thesis or judge that, application to our graduate program? Do I judge it differently? Yeah, probably. Yeah, maybe I do. But if you want to remain ethical, it's hard for me to come up with an argument that you did something wrong if you told me that you did the thing, right? Now, with that in mind, different institutions, different journals, different programs are, different fields are going to have different norms. So, I'd say that we're in in my own area of social psychology, we're in a sort of transitional phase where people still are getting used to the idea that this technology exists and are trying to figure out how to think about it or how to judge its use. I think that probably eventually, we will, as a field, we'll just land on, yeah, the technology's out there and we're going to assume that people are using it. Now, this is trickier, I imagine, if I were a creative writing professor. I imagine I'd be having a very different attitude about all of this, right? So I think the specifics in terms of ethics, fall to the field and field specific norms and assumptions about how what technology people are using. I mean, certainly I don't know, I don't know if it was ever considered unethical to use a spell checker, but I like to point out that, these technologies evolve in ways that they just sort of become normalized, they become infrastructure. To the point now where if I send the chair of my department something and it's got typos in it, her question isn't going to be, why didn't you know the right way to spell that? It's going to be, why didn't you use a spell checker? I can imagine that these norms will develop in such a way that people ask, hey, why didn't you run it through Site Assistant and ask it if you missed any major publications that you didn't reference that you should have? I can see that sort of future. I think that's probably where we're going. So.
Awesome. This is a question that came up when you were talking about rethinking classes, rethinking exams. So the question is, in class exam, in an era when most people are being pushed to online courses, what do you think?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So I don't teach any online courses, and I haven't really ever since this technology became ascendant. I might have once or twice early on. But yeah, that is a whole different world. Um, so there are a couple of different ways that you can approach that. The most obvious one is to actually go the route that I said I didn't want to go, and that is detection and prevention. And if you've taught an online course, I'm sure you're aware, there are plenty of tools, depending on, what software you're using to administer that class. There are tools that will do things like, basically watch your monitor, keep you from switching to a different browser tab, turn on the webcam and have it point to everything in your room to make sure that there's nothing there with you. I'm kind of skeptical of that approach. But I think that's probably if you're teaching an online course and you're using exams to assess knowledge in that way, that's probably that's probably the best combination. That's probably the best way of doing it. Um, the other part of me kind of hopes that this will spur a bit of a realignment away from online education. I understand it's valuable, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't do it. But in my experience, it's not as good a learning experience as an in-person class. So, I think it raises some interesting questions and, gets to some of the limitations of teaching in that way. You can always, go the other sort of third route and have people proctor the exams, and that of course adds expense and time to the process of taking the class. So yeah, I don't have any sort of one size fits all really good solution to that, but those are some options. So
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, another interesting question. Within the US, there are certain circles where this idea of the rise of anti-intellectualism is believed to be directly linked to the rise in AI. Do you feel that there's a potential worry that students will simply not engage with critical thought once this becomes more common and frequent?
yes. That's yeah, no, I think that is actually a real problem. Um, but I would bracket that a little bit. I don't think that started with AI. I think that begins, large scale, with the just sort of ubiquitous nature of information. Um, I think, it is simply a reality that, frankly, a lot of people just don't read. I sound like an old man now because I am an old man. A lot of people don't read in the way that they used to. And yes, I think that is a problem. Um, but also, it's also the case that nobody cares that I think that that's a problem. The technology is out there. And so I think, what people in my line of work need to be doing is thinking about, okay, what can I do to encourage that critical thinking, um, given the fact that this technology exists, ideally leveraging that technology, which is, again, one of the reasons why I'm thinking more in terms going forward about doing, sort of oral defenses, conversational sort of assessments, as opposed to a final written product. Um, I mean, I spend way more time in class discussions now probably than I did, 10 years ago. And part of that is probably because I want to hear students think through things in real time. Maybe, maybe we should be weighting class participation more heavily now, given that's the sort of landscape out there. But yes, it is absolutely a problem. I just don't think it necessarily started with AI. So.
Does SITE have research in languages other than English? Because there's a ton of research done in countries where English is not the main language.
Yes. Yes, it does. And in fact, my favorite example of this is I was given a demo for Wikimedia Poland, and they were like, "Does it speak Polish?" I was like, "Yeah, sure." And so I just said, "Hey, here's a question. Please respond in Polish and only include references written in Polish in your answer." And it did it. It was great. I don't speak Polish, but I was informed by my Polish friends that it worked just fine. So. Yeah, you can tell it basically any kind of prompt engineering that you would normally do with any other tool, you should be able to use an assistant and it should sort of just work out of the box.
Awesome. Okay, how is SITE different from consensus or elicit?
So, yeah, great question. So the big thing that makes Site different is the data. The fact that, lots of these other tools, they will have open access papers. They will use metadata. They will use abstracts to compose their answers. At Site, we're able to actually use the full text of not just open access papers, but paywalled closed access papers as well. And that is really the major number one differentiator between, what we do and what those other players do.
Awesome, thank you. Any plans for SITE or research solutions to develop a tool to detect AI-generated content like text, images, etc.?
At the moment, no, and I think I kind of spoke my mind about it earlier, and in my general feeling is that with the R&D team at our company, they're of a similar mind that sort of detection is really at present it's not a terribly doesn't appear to be a terribly promising area of sort of line of technology. That might change, but at the moment that's not something that we're really exploring.
Awesome. Okay, it looks like a few last questions here. Is there a change of methodological approach of fieldwork and observation in a discipline like traditional way of doing anthropology?
Oh, well, this is a great question, but I'm not an anthropologist. I mean, my knowledge of that field makes me think I mean, I think, the process of actually taking field notes, this strikes me as a really actually good use of this technology. You can take field notes, um, and then, basically use AI to summarize those field notes. And then that's your first draft of whatever paper you're publishing. That strikes me as a really useful, a really sort of perfect example of how this technology could be helpful in generation of knowledge. Um, but I'm probably missing something that I don't know about anthropological field work. But
Yeah, this is great.
good.
How is it possible for the software to access paywall articles?
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, we have indexing agreements with publishers where they agree to send us their paywalled paper, all of their papers, including the ones that are paywalled. So it's a legal arrangement that we have with them. And from their perspective, they get additional coverage of their material. So there's more stuff out there that's pointing to their stuff that they publish. So it's a reciprocal agreement. So.
Awesome. Okay. We're just about on time. One question I'd like to ask you just to end this webinar today. What's the one piece of advice you'd give to librarians or faculty or anyone on this call just starting their AI journey?
Um, oh, one piece of advice. Um, Go easy on yourself. Um, I'm giving this advice a lot these days. You'll, stuff in this area changes all the time. Um, don't be hard on yourself for not knowing the latest and greatest thing or the new trend or the new policy. Um, yeah, recognize this is a very active and changing area, and you are going to feel like you don't know what you're talking about all the time. Ask me how I know. So, just don't be too self-critical about that. That's just the nature of the beast. So
That's awesome. Yeah, great. Thank you so much for sharing that with everyone, including myself. Amazing. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. Also, thank you so much for participating with the questions. If any additional questions come up, I did share the links. Feel free to reach out. Sometimes questions come up after a webinar is over. If you have any additional concerns that come to mind, thank you so much, Sean, for walking us through this, sharing your thoughts, your critical thinking about large language models in academia. And yeah, have a great rest of your day, everyone. And I hope to see you on the next webinar.
thanks, y'all.